When a girl leaves her home in Toronto, she feels safe. Her family feels safe. When she says she'll be back in a few hours, people believe she will. The same was true in 1999, just as it is today. So, when in June of 1999, a 15-year-old left her home at 9 am to start a new job she had just gotten, her family trusted that they'd see her for dinner that evening. But hours passed, and then days, and then months before that 15-year-old would be seen again. This is the story of what happened that one June morning, and the one man everyone believes was responsible for it. This is the tragic story of Sharmini Anandavel. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Ashwarya.
And I'm Aryan.
And the case that I have for you today is one that makes me feel so uneasy because there is one person in this case who, in my opinion, hasn't been telling the whole truth for 25 years now. Speaking of the whole truth, this episode is sponsored by none other than the Whole
So
Truth
subtle,
Foods.
Aishwarya, so
Not subtle
subtle.
at all.
Yeah.
They're the ones sponsoring this episode and we love them. More on them later though. Right now we have a fun giveaway for you. Throughout the course of this episode, we'll be using the phrase whole truth multiple times and you're all supposed to count. Once the episode is done, let's say we said the phrase 3 times, go comment 3 whole truths. One lucky winner from all the people who correctly guess the number will get a box of whole truth proteins on us.
Okay, Shweta, that's enough of our not so subtle sponsor integrations. On with the case for today that you've been telling me I can't wait for.
Let's get into it. For the case today, I'm taking you to a morning on the 12th of June at 9 am to an apartment building in the Toronto's Don Mills neighborhood. According to an article on Sharmini's case by CBC News, the Don Mills neighborhood was, quote, developed after the Second World War and was originally white and middle class. But over time, it became one of Toronto's most diverse neighborhoods, striking in a city famous for its diversity, end quote. By the time 1999 rolled around, countless immigrant families had settled there after leaving or fleeing their home countries, much like the happy and close-knit family of the Anandavales. Having left civil war-torn Sri Lanka back in 1994, the Anandavales had made Toronto, but specifically Don Mills, their home. And Don Mills was homely, with neighbors that stopped by when they wanted to say hi and a community that stood up for each other. The Anandavales felt at peace there. So did the Anandavales' daughter, a beautiful 15-year-old girl named Sharmini. And that morning at 9 am on the 12th of June, Sharmini was up and ready for a very adult endeavor, her very first job. You see, Sharmini was in that age where she wasn't quite a full grown-up yet, but she was starting to feel like one. In fact, she was just days away from her 9th grade graduation, which in North America marks the transition from junior high to high school. So the idea of getting her own very first job and the idea of working hard to save up some of her own money to be able to buy some shoes for her graduation outfit was deeply exciting to Sharmini. It was exciting to Sharmini's parents too. The job was fairly simple, with Sharmini having to answer phone calls for a company, nothing complex, and she had gotten this job from the reference of a very trusted neighbor, a 23-year-old former cop named Stanley Tippett, who was very close to the kids living in Don Mills. In fact, he was so trusted that he was sort of the unofficial guard for the building, staying up at nights, making sure the building residents were safe.
Ishwara, one line of defense of the Indian police force that is not officially recognized, but I think plays a huge role are the guards of our society.
Oh, yes.
And I truly started appreciating that when we moved to the States and there was no stick
God.
being banged at 12 in the night to reassure us that all is well moment.
Yeah.
So I can totally understand how this man served that same function for the building.
Absolutely, yeah.
Reassuring the people that Ali's well,
And
right?
in an immigrant community that was used to that kind of
Yeah.
behavior, coming to Canada for the first time, I'm sure it felt great to
Definitely,
have
yeah.
someone. So it was that excitement and that trust in Stanley that had Sharmini up, ready, and out of the Anandavale home by 9 am. Her younger brother, 13-year-old Kathis, remembers that morning vividly. He remembers walking Sharmini to the elevator as she was rushing out of the house, as he teased her about her laundry that she hadn't done. And he remembers saying bye to her, knowing full well he'd be seeing her in just a few hours from them. But as the clock ticked, lunch passed, and then the sun began to set, the Anandavales began to get uneasy. Their daughter hadn't returned yet. The worst part was Sharmini's parents didn't even know where she was working to be able to call her new place of work and check up on her. Now, initially, this wasn't super weird to them because they knew that that day not only was Sharmini headed to her job, but she also needed to be headed to the mall right after to return a pair of earrings she hadn't liked. So, thinking maybe she was just at the mall a little bit longer, the Anandavales waited some more. But when the clock ticked some more and hours passed some more and darkness set over Toronto, the Anandavales knew they had to do something. And the only person they could think of in that moment was Stanley Tippett, the man who had helped Sharmini get the job. At that moment, the only reason the Anandavales thought of him was because they just wanted him to tell them where Sharmini was working. They had no reason to doubt Stanley or think that he hadn't told Sharmini the whole truth. But when the Anandavales walked out of their home, took just a few steps towards Stanley's apartment, and knocked on his door, they were surprised when nobody answered. That's when the Anandavales realized the home door was open. But as they turned the doorknob and opened the door to Stanley's home, their eyes were left wide open at what they were seeing. The apartment was vacant. No furniture, no sign of life, no sign of Stanley, the man who knew where Sharmini was. In a community so close-knit, with a neighbor who was so close to the Anandavales, something about Stanley's vacant apartment was so weird to them. And so now they knew what they had to do: call the police and report their daughter missing. The moment the police showed up, the Anandavales tried to raise alarm about Stanley and him being mysteriously missing on the day their daughter went missing. But the police needed to do their job. We know from covering so many cases that in these situations, it's not at all new for the police to think of the idea of a girl running away with a possible boyfriend or something. But the Anandavales knew that was simply not the case. They loved their daughter, and she was a responsible young girl who would never pull something like this off, certainly not when she had shown so much excitement for her upcoming graduation. Regardless of what the Anandavales thought though, the police officers at the scene needed to be sure, and the first place they thought of beginning their search was in Sharmini's room. If she had indeed run away, things should have been missing from the room. But that was not at all the case. Everything Sharmini had ever owned, excluding the pair of clothes she had worn that morning, was in that room. Nothing was amiss. Just from her room alone, it didn't really make sense that she had run away. But while nothing was missing from her room, there was something there, something kept on her table that stuck out to the police. It was a piece of paper. It was Sharmini's job application for a police division called the Metro Search Unit. Now, the moment the police see this, they think, maybe this is a police division, but we've never heard of this before. But they don't even need to think that for this job application to be weird to them. For starters, this application wasn't the job her parents thought she had. Secondly, all this application asked for was a name, date of birth, address, and signature. No reference, no questions to be filled out, nothing. Thirdly, this job application is printed out on regular printer paper present in all of our homes, with no logos, no police branding, no watermarks, no official seals, nothing. And lastly, this job application has a typo in it. While this piece of paper doesn't fully prove Sharmini's job had something to do with her disappearance, it's weird enough to the police that they now focus their next few days of their search on asking Sharmini's friends, families, and teachers about this job. And from this questioning, the police began to learn a little bit about who Sharmini really was. The investigator on this case, Matt Crone, said this about her. Quote, the interesting thing is, especially when you're dealing with a young person, is when you talk to the parents, they describe a person for you. You talk to the teachers, they describe a person for you. When you talk to friends, they describe a person for you. And these are three different people. But this was odd. You always got the same person with Sharmini. This is just a nice kid, hardworking, lots of fun, bright, funny, enjoyed life. End quote. It was obvious that after talking to the people who really knew her, she didn't really fit the profile of a runaway. From some of Sharmini's other friends, the police learnt a little more about her steps too. They know she left home at 9 am, but then one classmate says they saw Sharmini at the local Fairview Mall at around 10:30 am, while a different classmate says they saw her at Peanut Plaza, which is north of the mall, at 11:45 am. But it was some of Sharmini's closest friends who came forward to reveal some of the most peculiar details of this case. Firstly, the police realized that while Sharmini had told her parents she'd be answering phone calls for some company, she had told her friends something completely different. A boy from her class named Colin Braddock, who sat next to her in homeroom and called her his quote first crush, came forward to tell the police that he had noticed Sharmini being very anxious to find a job as the graduation was nearing. But then she suddenly got one and was very happy about it. Just a day before Sharmini left for the job, Colin remembers congratulating her, but also thinking it was weird that someone had given a 15-year-old a job so quickly. Quote, nobody really had jobs back then. I was surprised because like the closest thing to a job is a paper route. And then, Saturday happened. End quote. After Colin, it was like a domino effect, with friend after friend of Sharmini's coming forward to say that Sharmini had told them about the job offered to her by Stanley, and it was a job with the Metro Search Unit for Sharmini to work as an undercover for an anti-drug police operation.
Ishwara, have you seen 21 Jump Street?
I have.
This is exactly what this is.
This is what the job. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was also it was called
I don't know what it was called.
Not the Metro. See, if firstly somebody is advertising a false job in the police, I think the first thing they should do is use an actual police division.
Actual police division, right?
So that,
no, this is, and it's insane. She's a 15-year-old. Like that's.
Yeah, it makes no sense.
Makes no sense.
I couldn't do any job at 15, let alone undercover drug officer.
Now, this is where the police know things have gone too far. Not only does the Metro Search Unit sound completely made up, but also they know how the police force works. They cannot see any situation where a unit of the police would hire a 15-year-old to go undercover and bust drug rings. All of this was sounding simply impossible. Now the police were no longer focusing their theories on her running away. They were only focusing on the man who seemed to have offered Sharmini this bogus job. A man who obviously had been hiding the whole truth. Stanley Tippett. And the more the police learnt about Stanley, the weirder he got. The cases that we cover for you here at the Desi Crime Podcast are usually always riddled with lies. But crime isn't the only facet of life where lies are all pervasive. Aryan, you know this, I know this, all of you listeners know this, that the food we consume every day can also be based on lies.
Ishwara, just take the example of the urban legend of healthy orange juice. For some reason, we've been convinced by people that orange juice is supposed to be a staple of our breakfast because it's apparently healthier to drink squeezed out orange juice than eat the fruit itself.
Eat the orange,
we somehow assume that it's the healthier alternative because of the marketing that we've been fed.
Too, yeah.
But when I realized that a glass of orange juice has the same, if not more, sugar than a can of Coke, it just throws that entire idea out of the window.
No, and I fell prey to this too until Ariana is the one who smacked me on the head one day while I was drinking orange juice. And these lies in our foods is the exact reason we love today's sponsor, the Whole Truth Foods. They're an honest and clean company where the ingredients in their protein bars and protein shakes are all up front. No small little tag in the back, no extra asterisk that reveals some important information.
Take this bar for example. It's the peanut millet cocoa, and this is all it has. Okay, peanuts, which it should have, dates, whey, cocoa, ragi, and bajra. That's all. There is no XYZ preservative
that
or
sounds like some
aspartame
weird
or some
villain,
nonsensical thing added to it. It's just what they say it is.
Another reason we love this partnership with them is because we were consumers before they came on as sponsors. This is the most honest equation where we've absolutely genuinely loved and consumed their products.
The best way to prove that is, guys, we were supposed to have far more bars on display, but unfortunately we've been eating them throughout the shoot. And they have been depleting. I'm not even. This is like, making this up, guys. These are just wrappers that are lying around. because this is fueling the show and us as we
Yep.
narrate these cases for you. So if you want to get your hands on one of these bad boys, you can visit thewholetruthfoods.com or find the link in our description. Use the code DESI20 at checkout. You'll get 20% off. Unfortunately, we are not getting any kickbacks from it. It's just a way to, show how
Yeah.
awesome our listeners are. So go buy the product. Get these bars, guys. They're delicious.
They're so good. Try the orange flavor if you believe me.
Okay, now back to the episode.
The police learned that Stanley Tippett was a kid who, by all accounts, had a rough childhood. He was born with Treacher-Collins syndrome, which affected his facial bone and tissue development and caused facial deformities like very small ears and slanting down eyes, making him a kid who always needed special education classes and one that stood out to people, for which he was bullied, teased, and cornered throughout his childhood. In fact, the bullying against Stanley got so ruthless and so physical, his mother had to call the police to save him from other neighborhood kids multiple times. He was also born to a poor family and in a single-parent home, causing him to grow up in very bare-bones government housing with his mother and brothers. But by 1999, when Stanley was living in the building of the Anandavales, it seemed like he had turned things around for himself. He had gotten married to a woman he loved and he had even had a child with her. By that time, he had even had a job with the police as part of the bomb squad, which is what made him such a trustworthy neighbor and de facto police guard. The only problem was, his job with the police was a complete and absolute lie. Police learned that Stanley hadn't revealed the whole truth to the Anandavales and all of the other residents of his apartment building when he claimed he was a former cop and that his facial deformities were due to an accident while working with the bomb squad. And when the residents learned this, that all of this was an absolute lie, they couldn't believe it. They used to let Stanley take their kids to the swimming pool or to sports classes because they trusted him so much.
Aishwarya, something about an older man taking kids to the swimming pool just doesn't sit right with me, and
Yeah,
it doesn't
I
matter
know.
how trustworthy he appears or
agree.
whether he's been in the
Or
police.
giving your kids job applications that you don't fully know about.
Yeah.
It's all really weird and it gets weirder.
There is this show called To Catch a Predator. It's
Okay.
one that I've binged. It was a big show
I have no
with
idea.
a man named Chris Hansen, where he basically tracks down child predators,
Okay.
right?
Oh, wow.
And I'm just sort of trying
Getting
the
those
vibe
vibes.
that is this something to do
So is
with
the
him being
police.
a pedophile?
So is the police. Heck, the apartment residents recount he even had a police jacket that he would wear all the time, which also made them trust him a little more. But the trust of the residents had been abused. Quote, the building itself had a lot of people in it that were new to the country. When he told parents that he was a police officer or an ex-police officer, they accepted it. They obviously felt safe enough to allow their children to go swimming with him, said Matt Crane, the inspector on Sharmini's case. That's not all though. The police learned that Stanley had had more than one run-in with the law, a lot of them involving his impersonation of being a cop and his weird fixation with children. His first police report came in 1991 when Stanley, at the age of 16, had set his school teacher's desk on fire after he had stolen the classroom keys and broken into the classroom after school hours. Shortly after this incident, Stanley had followed a teenage girl off a bus in Toronto and attacked her by pointing a pellet gun to her head and telling her to lie down on the ground. The only reason this girl believes she escaped that encounter unscathed was because she thought quickly on her feet and told Stanley that she had AIDS and that she was on her period that day, which scared Stanley away.
Aishwarya, to have that presence of
mind is
while you are
insane.
being killed, literally. In
Killed,
your mind, you're
assaulted,
being killed, right?
Yes, yes.
To come up with that, nobody
Amazing.
prepares for a situation like that.
I know.
Wow.
Amazing. This girl did report Stanley to the police, and Stanley even went to court for the incident, where he somehow convinced the court he only wanted to rob her and so got off on an attempted robbery charge. After that, in 1998, Stanley had taken the bikes of some of the neighborhood kids as part of a quote police operation, and then a month after that, he was even arrested by the police when he was caught trying to make a fake arrest himself. Before the police learnt this, they only doubted Stanley because he had allegedly given the job application to Sharmini and because he was missing too. But now the police 100% were pointing fingers at Stanley because he had this track record of pretending to be a cop. This, combined with the totally fake police unit and the job application, puts him smack dab as suspect number 1 in Sharmini's disappearance. So now the police really needed to quickly find Stanley because Sharmini had been missing for days. And anyone who knows anything about missing people is that those first 24 hours are crucial to finding them. Every day after that, the odds of a missing person being found alive reduced dramatically. Luckily for the police and the Anandavales though, Stanley was not difficult to find. Turns out he hadn't moved out of the apartment the day of Sharmini's disappearance. He had moved out 2 weeks before then, and he was now settled in a town 2 hours away with his family. That is where the police found him, and he readily came into the station for an interrogation too. And in that interrogation, Stanley gave the police a really weird story. He tells them he did in fact give Sharmini a job application, but it was a job application from the local pool, which he only gave her because he had seen her stressed about wanting a job. So he's claiming the job Sharmini ended up going for and the one for which the police found the application in Sharmini's room was not the one Stanley had offered her. So then the police were like, alright, so you didn't give her the job and we can assume you weren't in Toronto the day she left for her job either, right? To which he says, I was actually in Toronto. Allegedly, Stanley had driven 2 hours from his town to Toronto the day Sharmini had gone missing at 9 a.m. when he had driven by his old apartment building, the building of the Anandavales. Then he said he drove from there to a grass cutting job he had, but then somewhere in the middle he had car troubles, so he stopped in the parking lot of the Fairview Mall, which is where, if you remember, a friend of Sharmini saw her, which is where she had gone, according to her family, to return those earrings. But the weird thing is, when the police checked with the shop that she was supposed to return the earrings to, there was no record of her having made the return. So either Sharmini did reach the mall and so did Stanley, and something happened to her before she could make the return, or the person who saw her there was mistaken and Stanley being there was just a huge, weird coincidence. After the mall, Stanley says he went to his job where he worked for a few hours and then went back home. But while Stanley is describing his day's timeline to the police, something is sticking out to them. Something mentioned by Ashley Flowers in her episode on Sharmini. In that interrogation, Stanley was describing some details of his day in excruciating detail.
Chor ki daadi mein tinka.
Chor ki daadi mein tinka, yes, over-explaining.
And projecting
100%,
whatever, yeah.
100%.
Classic.
For example, while describing his time at his grass cutting job, he can't stop seem to mentioning a cup he was drinking from, talking about how he picked up the cup and then drank from it, then kept it down next to him and then cut some more grass, after which he picked up the cup again and drank from it again. But then there were other parts of his day where he just couldn't describe anything, such as the time he spent in the Fairview Mall parking lot. And because he had described some parts of his day in way too much detail, the parts where he didn't do that stood out to the police so much more. Regardless of the police's belief that Stanley wasn't telling the whole truth though, nothing concrete about Sharmini came from this interrogation, and the best the police could do was let him go and just monitor his every move while focusing on other theories about Sharmini's disappearance. And one of those other theories was gang-related violence, because in the 1999s in Toronto, there was a severe rise in such violence from 2 prominent Tamil gangs. But no matter how hard the police searched this theory, nothing came of it, and they kept returning to the theory involving Stanley.
Ishwara, whatever we hear about sort of Indo-Canada relationship right now, it's a very different community that is embroiled in that mess, but I never knew Canada had Tamil gangs.
Tamil gangs, 2 very prominent Tamil gangs, to the point where the Canada police and the Canada system had set up what they call the Tamil Task Force. Wow. And the job of this task force was essentially to help stop these gangs. But then the Tamil community turned on this task force because sort of it seemed to them like the task force was targeting all Tamilians, right? Yeah. And just the name, the Tamil Task Force, made it sound like it was the Tamils that were at fault and not necessarily the 2 gangs. So there was a rift between the Tamil community and this task force. So it's crazy. There's a lot of history.
The more you know.
Yeah, the more you know. So now the police were waiting for Stanley to do something. And then Stanley did something. Yet again. And made the police feel like he was their guy. Just days after his interrogation with the police, Stanley sold his car for a total of $10 to a scrapyard, even though he had very recently gotten a new engine fitted inside the car, which had costed him more than $1,000. All of this stood out to the police as very suspicious. The police headed to the scrapyard before they could destroy the car and inspected every inch of it. and while they found absolutely no evidence inside it, whether DNA or otherwise, they did notice that the entire lining of the trunk had been removed and was missing. But that lining was never found. And after this hunt for Stanley's car, the search for Sharmini reached a screeching halt. Months passed, 4 months to be precise, until any news of Sharmini came. And when it came, it was the news most dreaded by everyone who had been waiting with so much hope. On the morning of the 9th of October, a father and his son were out for a walk in the East Don Parklands of Toronto, about 10 minutes from where Sharmini used to live. And during their walk, they saw something unmistakable in a ditch with a large fallen log on top, a human skeleton. Badly decomposed from the Toronto summer, all that was left now was a skull, some much longer bones, and teeth. The rest of the bones were found all over parts of the forest, likely spread apart by coyotes that had torn apart the body, including nails with blue nail paint on them, the same color Sharmini had on her nails the morning she left her home. The moment this father and son duo placed a call to the police straight away put Matt Crane to the task of going to the scene because everyone knew of Sharmini's case. And Matt Crane was the man to use the teeth found on the skull to DNA match them to Sharmini's family. It was a match. But the discovery of Sharmini's body didn't bring the police even a step closer to finding her murderer. The level of decomposition from the many months her body had spent out in what was the second hottest summer in Toronto history in many years had left no trace of any DNA evidence anywhere near her.
Ishwara, in a scenario like when the suspect number one has, his the presence matches the time of disappearance of the person, his car has been mysteriously been given to a scrapyard and doesn't have the lining of the trunk. Can the police just get a warrant to investigate his entire house? Did they do that to scour for other evidence?
Not at this point, and I don't know. I don't think I've read a report that says they did it at this point. They do it later and we'll come to that. But they most certainly can do that.
Yeah, okay.
From my knowledge, yeah.
Because I mean, this is not a suspect number one which is just theoretical.
Just
there
a
is
random theory,
good circumstantial evidence backing up their claims.
Yeah, no, I agree. And they'll do that. And with that, the search for Sharmini's killer comes to a screeching halt once again. And this time not for months, but for years. The police have no idea what to do anymore or how long to watch Stanley for. And so in the horde of new cases that appear on their desk, Sharmini's gets buried in the bottom of the pile along with other cold cases. Sharmini's family continue to believe Stanley was the man responsible for the death of their daughter, but there's nothing they can do either. But little do they know, they don't actually have to do anything. They just have to let Stanley be Stanley, and eventually he'd land himself in trouble. And that is exactly what happened in the year 2000, a year after Sharmini's death, by which time Stanley had moved to a different third town named Oshawa. In Oshawa, a cashier at a grocery store came forward to accuse Stanley of stalking her, for which her grocery store even went on to file a no trespass order against him, banning him from ever coming in again. A couple of years after that, Stanley moved with his wife and kids to a different town, this time called Collingwood, where he got caught harassing and stalking a neighbor after she made it clear to him that she wasn't interested in his romantic gestures.
Ishwara, this approach that the police seems to have taken of this man is bound to trip up again, and so we'll wait it out.
Yeah.
That approach doesn't work. I mean, your
and there's
job
so many
isn't
people
to,
that get hurt in the middle of that.
Of course, your job as the police is not to let the criminal make a mistake, but to either ensure that the criminal makes more mistakes because you are interrogating or investigating them,
right,
or actively uncovering the mistakes they've made in the past.
I know. At least in Sharmini's case, I think it wasn't necessarily that the police had that approach. It's that that's the only approach they could take.
Okay.
Because in her case, there was nothing other than circumstantial evidence that tied Stanley to Sharmini.
Yeah,
there
but
was
again,
absolutely no DNA evidence.
I feel like they should have gone into the house much sooner if they haven't already.
Again, yeah, so we don't know if they ever did that and whether or not they found anything. But yeah, it is tragic that so many small incidents kept piling up, yet this man never received proper punishment. Like by the time this incident with the grocery store workers happening, so much has happened in the past with his previous assault with Sharmini and his links to that case. So there definitely should have been maybe like a year-long sentence, a 6-month-long sentence, something, right?
It's like a probation of some sort.
Probation, right. So now Stanley is accused of stalking his neighbor, who says she isn't interested in him, but Stanley didn't take no for an answer though, and instead began to sit outside of this neighbor's window in his red van, from which he would just stare at her for hours. If that wasn't enough, Stanley then went on to report this woman to the Children's Society in Canada, filing a false allegation against her for mistreating her kids. Stanley got reported by her, but all he got for it was probation. Surprise, surprise, after this, Stanley moved with his family to a different town, this time called Peterborough, where the police immediately had their eyes on him because of his past criminal record. And sure enough, he proved their instinct correct. Stanley was first caught in this new town when he offered a 12-year-old a fake job at the YMCA, which led this 12-year-old's mom to call the police on Stanley. For this interaction, Stanley never got actual prison time, and so just a few months later, he went on to do the same thing to another young girl he met at the parking lot of the local Walmart. This girl had been looking for a job, and lo and behold, Stanley showed up, offering her a job at the YMCA yet again. In the ruse of this fake YMCA job, he ends up getting this girl's home address somehow, after which Stanley begins doing to her what he was doing to his neighbor, waiting outside the girl's home, watching her from her window, and dropping stuff off to her like a card on her birthday signed Jason, which obviously wasn't even his name. Believe it or not, he even told this woman that her duties while working with the YMCA would include some police work. Then a while after he had offered her this job, Stanley saw this girl working at a Taco Bell, and he got very publicly angry at her for not taking his job but taking this one at Taco Bell instead. Upon seeing Stanley so angry, this girl found his behavior very suspicious and ended up calling the YMCA and asking if this job was ever real, and the YMCA was appalled to the point that they called the police on Stanley. The police, who already had their eyes on Stanley, ended up seizing his vehicle in response to this call from the YMCA and ended up finding in his car something the inspector called, quote, your abduction kit 101. These things included duct tape, rope, plastic sheets, plastic cable ties, a hammer, and a knife under the driver's seat, as well as a pistol under Stanley's bed when they searched his home. For this incident and what seemed to be a very scary pattern of behavior, Stanley was sentenced to 2 years in prison for criminal harassment.
Aishwarya, so far, what about his family, his wife and his kids?
Which is so weird. He's still married. He still has these kids. And he's having more kids.
Do we know what his wife was thinking of this at this time?
We have no reports that
it
say
makes
that.
So like this to me is like a single predator's behavior.
Single
not
predator
somebody
living
who has
alone in a
family
home.
who
Yeah,
has kids.
I know.
Did he have daughters?
He did have daughters, unfortunately, which is the most tragic part.
Ugh.
But if you think being in prison stopped him, oh, you're so wrong. Shortly after prison, Stanley was caught by his own kids' school for lurking outside and staring at the kids, which made the kids uncomfortable. This led to Stanley's kids' school filing a no trespass order against him, which also he ended up breaking. While this incident with the school is appalling and terrifying, the worst of Stanley's incidents came in the wee morning hours of August 6, 2008, when countless residents of Stanley's town made calls to the police saying they could hear screams of a girl coming from the forest near the local school, and the screams said, "No, please stop," over and over again. When the police arrived at the scene, they saw a man running out of the woods into a red van, which led to a high-speed chase across the streets of the town. But the cops eventually lost the red van. But they got its license plate number, which turned out to be Stanley's, and even noticed the man's very distinctive facial features. Back at the woods, the cops found a 13-year-old who had a torn shirt and wasn't wearing anything below the waist, and she seemed drunk. She was coming back from a friend's birthday party with a different friend when a man in a red van stopped next to them and asked if they wanted a ride, to which the girls agreed. This man then dropped the other friend to her home, but then took this 13-year-old to the woods where he tried to rape her. Now, while the police are gathering evidence and making sure this young girl is safe, they get a call from none other than Stanley Tippett, who tells the police that he needs their help because he's been carjacked. He tells them he did give the girls a ride and dropped one of them off home, but that's when he got carjacked by two men who took his car. Arhan, is anything weird to you about Stanley making this call to the police saying his car was carjacked, other than the fact that obviously it seems like he's lying?
Nothing that I can tell right off the bat.
And this is a detail that didn't stand out to me either, but is mentioned by Ashley Flowers in her coverage
All
of
Hail
the
the
case.
Queen.
All Hail the Queen. It says Stanley makes this call to the police to report the carjacking, but completely fails to mention the fact that there was a girl in his car.
Yeah.
A 13-year-old who's now theoretically kidnapped. And he's calling the police and saying, listen, my car's gone.
Yeah.
There's 2 men who've taken it. Not at all saying there's a 13-year-old in that car who's gone too.
Yeah.
Which is so odd, so weird.
Mm-hmm.
Now, regardless of his story though, the police officers on the spot noticed Stanley's distinctive facial features and knew for sure that the man who came out of the woods was in fact Stanley. As guilty as Stanley seems at this moment though, it's worth mentioning that 2 used condoms were found in Stanley's car that night, and the DNA from none of them matched Stanley. There was also semen remains on the clothes of the 13-year-old, which also did not match Stanley. But that sample was way, way, way too small to match anyone, according to the forensic examiner. But this incident, combined with decades worth of criminal and predatory behavior on Stanley Tippett's part, got him convicted in December of 2009 on 7 counts of attack, kidnapping, sexual assault, and sexual interference. For those counts, he was given life in prison, and he was classified as a special kind of offender called a dangerous offender, severely reducing his chances of ever getting parole. Once Stanley went to prison for this incident, the Toronto police reopened their investigation into Stanley in relation to the murder of Sharmini. And they didn't just open this case up for no reason. They did it because they actually thought they might have a shot at finding new evidence and resolving this case. You remember the paper on which Sharmini's fake job application was printed? The police had learned that that application was printed on thermal paper, which according to the CBC article, quote, changes color when exposed to heat and is commonly used to print receipts in cash registers or debit terminals, end quote. The thing about this paper is that it's always been difficult to get fingerprints on it. But as technology developed by the late 2000s, the police thought they could actually analyze it and retrieve fingerprints from it. This application ended up being sent to the Centre for Forensic Sciences in Canada, but the centre unfortunately came back with the verdict that due to being improperly stored, the application couldn't yield any results. Regardless though, Stanley Tippett is still in prison to this day in the Beaver Creek Institution in Ontario, even if not for the murder of Sharmini. He has continued to deny involvement in Sharmini's murder, even changing his story to say he never gave her any job application, from the pool or not, and never took the children of the building swimming, something Sharmini's own brothers remember very vividly. In fact, when interviewed in recent years, he refuses to talk about Sharmini or even take her name, referring to her instead as the girl from the quote Don Mills incident. In an interview exclusive with CBC News, he denies other allegations against himself too. For example, he says the neighbor he was accused of stalking was stalking him in reality because she had a thing for married men, a trait she admitted had been passed down to her from her mother. He also claimed that the material in his car that was called the quote Abduction Kit 101 was merely a collection of regular tools we all have in our own homes. For the girl he gave the fake job application to in the Walmart parking lot, he says he did make the fake job application, but only because he was competing with this girl for a different job and felt jealous of her and wanted her to tap out of the job race in that job. He also denies ever attempting to kidnap or rape the 13-year-old in the woods, and in defense, he points to the fact that his DNA was never found on the girl's clothes. He too, he says, was a victim in that incident and was only targeted for his kindness. But his claims mean nothing to the Canadian system, which has classified Stanley as a quote, sensation seeker, impulsive individual with a personality disorder, duplicitous and a narcissist, end quote, and someone who can 100% never ever step foot in society again without putting people at risk. Contrary to Stanley's own claims about Sharmini, Matt Crane, the investigator who worked on Sharmini's case tirelessly and is now retired, to this day believes Stanley was his guy in that case and that he still isn't telling the whole truth. He believes Stanley was grooming Sharmini and offered her the undercover police job because it had an element of secrecy and so would prevent Sharmini from talking about it. Quote, I'm absolutely certain this is the person who did this, is what Crane says whenever he's asked about Sharmini and Stanley. To the Anandavales though, who killed their daughter Sharmini is a matter of secondary consideration. Their loss comes primarily from the loss of their daughter on the 12th of June, 25 years ago, the day their lives stood still. Today, her younger brothers, Kathis and Dinesh, are in their mid-30s and are married to sisters, making them a very close-knit family, but one that to this day feels a heavy void. But they say they don't really have too many memories from that time, memories of Sharmini. That didn't stop Kathis from keeping his daughter's middle name Sharmini though. Quote, one of the things I've always kind of struggled with is having kids and telling them that I had a sister at one point, said Kathis in an interview. But the brothers are learning to navigate this dynamic as their own kids near the age they were when Sharmini walked out of the door. Sharmini will not return. Everyone has accepted that. She will never walk through the door to tell the tale of her first day at her job. But maybe there is some peace in knowing that when Kathis and Dinesh's kids come back home or get their first jobs or attend their first school graduations, a little bit of Sharmini will return through them. If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Kadak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.